Let's take a look at what we're going to do tonight. I want to do a little bit of background about Esther because Esther is a little bit different as far as scripture goes. We're going to talk about chiasmus, which was surprising to me. Then we're going to talk about Ishtar and Marduk and conflicts that exist in the book of Esther. And did you see the hand of the Lord or the hand of God? And then I want to spend a little bit of time at the end on the festival of Purim, plus anything else you would like to talk about. So let's just look at a little bit on the background of Esther. God is actually not mentioned anywhere in the text, although he's hidden there throughout, kind of in the background. And originally, Esther was not part of the canon of scripture. It was more pushed towards the Apocrypha at the back of the book. And people said it's not really scripture, it's Apocrypha. But then over time, it came forward to the front of the book again. And the Septuagint version of Esther is a little bit different. It adds about 100 different verses or additional verses to the book. It corrects the absence of God and uses his name a little bit more. And then also there are some dramatic prayers and things that involve God directly that we don't see in our particular version of the Old Testament. A lot of people initially thought that the whole idea of the book of Esther was like a folk tale or a play, almost a farce that was characterized by reversals of fortune. Some even classify it as a historical romance, which was kind of interesting when I read that. It does kind of give the origin story for the festival of Purim that we'll discuss a little later, as I've already said. The other interesting part about it is that it's nowhere found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's no corroborating evidence of it being scripture from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which was kind of intriguing to me as well. But most intriguing of all was the fact that it's written in this classic chiasmus structure that I never saw at all until I listened to a podcast that was talking about chiasmus. So, as a reminder of what a chiasmus is, I have this little thing on the left, a little diagram. Never let a fool kiss you or a kiss fool you. That's chiasmus, where they put the front at the back and then the back to the front again. And so in a classic chiasmic structure, they put the most important thing right in the middle. And so you can see from the diagram on the right that the structure of Esther is a giant chiasmus. It starts with the greatness of Xerxes, and then it talks about the banquets. Then Esther is identified as a Gentile. Haman, the evil guy, is elevated. There's an edict against the Jews. There's a conversation between Mordecai and Esther. There's the big banquet. And then the part where Mordecai is honored is kind of the central point, and then it reverses out. You also notice in the red there, the Septuagint, the additional stuff from the Septuagint is in red. And you can see that it also is effectively part of the chiasmus as well. I wanted to look at Esther 6, 1 to 3, because this is the central point. I should explain too that this is a Jewish version of the scriptures, not the King James version that we normally use. I'm using this one because it's a little bit easier, I think, to understand. That night, sleep deserted the king, and he ordered the book of records, the annals, to be brought, and it was read to the king. And there it was found written that Mordecai had denounced two of the king's officers who guarded the threshold, who had plotted to do away with the king. What honor or advancement has been conferred upon Mordecai for this? The king inquired. Nothing at all has been done, replied the king's servants, who were in attendance on him. So it just so happened that one night he couldn't sleep. He reads back some of the records and then he remembers that Mordecai hasn't been rewarded for his diligence in saving him. So the next day, Haman comes in, and the king asks him, what should be done to a man whom the king delighted to honor? Now, Haman's thinking, oh, he's obviously talking about me, because Haman's kind of this conceited guy. And Haman says to the king, for the man whom the king delighted to honor, let the royal apparel be brought, which the king uses to wear, and the horse that the king rideth on, and the crown royal which is set upon his head, and let this apparel and the horse be delivered to the hand of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man withal, whom the king delighteth to honor, and bring him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor. So basically, he's saying, throw a parade for him and honor him for being such a valiant and wonderful guy, thinking he's doing that for himself. But then the king says to Haman, make haste and take the apparel and the horse, as thou hast said, and do even so to Mordecai the Jew that sitteth at the king's gate. And so this really, really kind of frosted Mordecai. And this is kind of a turning point in the whole story of Esther that helps us to see that there's these reversals that are going to happen. I wanted to talk a little bit about the king, Xerxes. I don't think a lot of people know very much about Persian history, so I think this is appropriate. He was the son of Darius, and Darius was quite a good king, his father. Xerxes ruled from 486 to 465, and interestingly enough, he was assassinated in 465 by the commander of the royal bodyguard. And so you can understand why he took such precautions to make sure that nobody just approached him willy-nilly, that they had to really have an appointment and that he had to know them very, very well. The court intrigues that happened during the lives of these kings, particularly the Persians, was very complex and very involved. There's volumes written about all the intrigues that go on behind the scenes. He was part of that famous invasion of Greece in 480 BC. I don't know if you know of the Battle of Thermopylae and some of those very distant past battles, but they invaded Greece twice, and both times they were pushed back, which was kind of a phenomenal thing because Persia was such a huge nation, and the Greek were such a small, little tiny country, and they weren't even unified, and yet they were able to unify and push the Persians back.
That with the Spartans and people like that?
Yeah, exactly. So like the 300 Spartans and all those movies that have been made are all about that particular period of time. The text presents Xerxes as this two-dimensional kind of a character, not very deep at all, that he's really kind of a fickle king. He's almost considered a bad king, and he elevates and punishes people on a whim or on a suggestion from his advisors, whom initially, obviously, his advisors were very, very poor advisors. I don't know if poor is the right term. Perhaps self-centered would be a better way to describe some of his early advisors, particularly Hammond, who was very power hungry and who became very easily upset when things didn't go as he planned. He thought, being the second man in the kingdom, as powerful as he was, that he should have everything his way. And when it didn't go his way, he got really frustrated. And as I talked about before, the court intrigues at that time were very perilous. You could easily lose your life by offending the wrong person. There's an interesting similarity between Joseph, who sold into Egypt, and Esther. Can you see any parallels there?
Well, they both found themselves in precarious situations, but they worked hard to make the best of it by being kind to others. And
Yeah, Esther wasn't in servitude in the same sense that Joseph was, but she was in a kind of servitude, being a woman in court at that time and subject to the whims of the king was kind of like being in servitude. You know, from a woman's perspective, Sue, how would you have felt about that?
I think the women at that time were, I'm just wondering if they were used to that. That was part of the culture. I don't know.
It would have been part of the culture, and they seemed to have a workaround for it.
But Esther, in her own right, was a very intelligent young woman. When her people were in danger, she basically knew what she had to do. And she had to have courage to do it.
And she had to do it in a specific way and in a specific manner. She couldn't just barge ahead and just say, you know, release my people. That would have got her killed.
Well, I was just going to say, in answer to your question, today's woman probably wouldn't put up with that, being in servitude to a man, because we're now known as, we have the right to vote, we're known as people now, we're not property in times gone by, basically.
Yeah,
But
but that's only been for 100 years.
I know. And we're still, as women, we're still trying to fight for a few rights here. But
It's
anyway,
interesting. that the original queen, Vashti, I think was her name, she wouldn't put up with it. She wasn't the same as Esther. You know, when the king commanded her to come, she rebelled. And I was reading an interesting take on it. One of the takes indicated that the men had already had a 180-day binge, let's call it. And then round two was another 7-day binge. And they were probably inebriated quite sufficiently. And then when he called for her to come, one of the texts suggests that he wanted her to come either completely without clothes or very scantily dressed. And that's when she finally drew the line and said, "No, I'm not coming."
It's like she was being summoned to be the entertainment.
Well, yeah, imagine having to parade almost naked or naked in front of, well, 127 drunk people at the minimum who were the leaders of each of the different provinces. And so she drew the line and said, "No, I'm not going to do that," which in her day would have been an absolutely astounding thing to say no. And then, of course, the men are all concerned that if the queen says no, then all the women across the kingdom are going to say no. And so one particular article suggested that she was not only dethroned, but she was likely beheaded as well. So it was a very difficult decision. Both the stories of Joseph and Esther illustrate to us the kindness, the grace, the loving kindness of the Lord in taking care of his children, in helping us despite the very perilous conditions that we find ourselves in.
So Esther, I mean, this is sort of some of the subtext, but Esther must have spent a lot of time trying to learn the customs because she wasn't Persian. So she had to learn the customs, learn the protocols, and do it in a way, like in a non-rebellious way, because she was compliant. But yet she had to be true to herself, I'm sure. But because she had, I mean, it's evident that she knew, like, well, she also knew how to fill her role that she was given, and even though she wasn't really seeking after it. So she really did do a lot to really make the best of the situation.
It's true. She did receive a 1 year kind of advanced tutoring, and the eunuch that was in charge of the women, who took a liking to her, really spent a lot of time. It seems like when you read the subtext of it, that he
And
really liked her, and he gave her all the
but
inside scoop.
she wisely chose, okay, no, I need to learn how to do this. I need to make the
Yeah,
best of this. And kind of like what Joseph did. I really like the parallel with
yeah, it's a really
Well,
interesting parallel.
but I think it was very much her character.
yeah.
She had to be, because she was raised at this particular time to save her people.
And Mordecai also coached her to do that as well. I mean, it was,
Yeah, he encouraged her to step forward and be part of this. Some people called it a beauty pageant, to try to impress the king, and she was encouraged at different levels to do it, and certainly educated to do it. Now we find this story. I call it a story because there's no historical evidence of this ever happening. It is almost a romance story in that sense, that they've taken the time period, the area, the people, and they've made a story up, but there's no historical evidence of any kind for the Persian king to have married a Jewish woman and made her the queen. We can't find any history behind it. That's not to say it didn't happen. It's just that we can't find any history. But why were the people there still in Persia? Cyrus, the king's grandfather, had released the people to go home and had given them money and encouraged people to go back to their home countries and to build their local temples. And some people chose to stay in Persia. There's no reason given in the scriptures for this, but anybody want to speculate as to why people would have stayed? Why stay in Persia when the opportunity was there for you to go home?
well, my speculation, and we see this in other times in history, where if they've been there for a while, it's really hard for them to uproot. It's their home, and they do just want to stay. Where on the other hand, there's also those that can't wait to get out of there. So it does seem to be human nature to, oh, this is my home, I want to stay there. Because they were there in Persia quite a long time before they were released.
If Xerxes is in fact the king of this time period, and he starts in 485. That's almost 100, a little more than 100 years from the time when people were transported. So they did have a history of it. I think people, to some degree, get comfortable where they are, and it would have been a hardship to travel as far as they had to travel to go and rebuild from scratch, especially if you were already settled and you had a good job, a good position, like Mordecai did. Then there's not a lot of incentive to go. And yet, there's this other part, like you said, of the people who are just drawn to want to return to Zion, to be in that holy place that the Lord has designated. But it opens up an interesting story. It opens up an interesting possibility that is kind of relevant for us today. But before we talk about that, I want to talk about Ishtar. Ishtar is an ancient Mesopotamian goddess, and I had to really struggle to find a picture of her with clothes on. She was considered the queen of heaven, and the Greek equivalent was Aphrodite or maybe Athena. She was the enforcer of divine justice. She was associated with love, war, beauty, political power.
Those four go together so naturally.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. I'm surprised Sue didn't slap you while you were saying it. But anyway, when I say ancient Mesopotamia, do you guys understand the concept of Mesopotamia? Meso means between or in the middle. Potamia or Potomac is the river. And so Mesopotamia is the area between the two rivers that was anciently civilized first. So we're talking Babylon, Assyria, and then Persia settled in this very fertile area between the two major rivers in that area. So that's where the term Mesopotamia comes from. And so Ishtar as a goddess goes all the way back to pre-Babylonian times, to Samaria and to some of the very, very ancient cultures. And the reason that I bring up Ishtar as this goddess is because if you look at the striking similarity, not in looks, but in the name of Ishtar and Esther, it starts you kind of thinking that if they're making this story up, that they would naturally use a name that most of the people in the area would easily recognize. And so Ishtar and Esther are very, very close. And there's a suggestion in the scholarly writing that they did this on purpose. And so they're using as a Persian name this idea of Ishtar to Esther. And it gets even more complex because if you look at the ancient Mesopotamian god, who's the king of the gods, he's Marduk. And that would be the Greek equivalent of Zeus, and he's associated with water and vegetation, fertility, judgment, magic, and dragons, incidentally. And we're going to study a little later in the book of Daniel. Well, we may not necessarily study, but in some Bibles in the book of Daniel, there's some additional chapters, and one of them describes Bel or Baal and the dragon, who they think kind of morphed out of Marduk. And the Septuagint kind of gives this credence because these chapters are in the Septuagint as well, but they're not in our Old Testament that we know and love through the King James Version. And when you look at Marduk and Mordecai, you can see that again, there's this freakish kind of similarity. They've changed the name and presented a figure that people would be very familiar with, these ancient gods and goddesses. And so this really kind of emphasizes the whole idea that this could be just a story, not necessarily 100% factual. You know how sometimes when you watch a movie today, it'll say that these characters are fictional, but they're based on real life characters. You've probably seen that at the beginning of some movies. And so some scholars are suggesting that both Esther and Mordecai are like that. They're based on historical people, but the story is somewhat fictionalized. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, I mean, I can think of, I mean, stories that we're also familiar with. One comes to mind is Romeo and Juliet, right? And
Sure.
it would be easy maybe for somebody to think, oh, didn't that happen? Like it's such a common story. It must have happened.
So let's move on a little bit to the conflicts that exist in the book of Esther, which are very intriguing. So here we have a group of people who have chosen not to return to the Holy Land. And they're trying to maintain their religious customs, fasting, etc., refusing to bow down to idols, while still living in Persia and trying to accommodate the culture that they live in. So they have a distinct religion that they're following, customs that they follow, and they're trying to live within the framework of the government of the country in which they live. And so, for example, Esther throws a feast for the people that are around her, but she doesn't actually participate in the feast. And Mordecai works for the king and shows a certain amount of patriotism towards the Persian country by preventing this assassination attempt. And throughout the book, there's this conflict that plays out as the Jews try to maintain their religion and this unique identity that they have, while also trying to live happily outside of the promised land within the Persian culture. And so we have this conflict, this to and fro throughout the whole story of the book of Esther and throughout, I think, most of the Old Testament, especially during the dispersion time frame, when they're facing assimilation, but trying to live within another culture without being eliminated. So it's this assimilation versus survival that keeps playing out in specifically the book of Esther, but in some other terms that we'll talk about later. So there's this conflict that even though they chose not to return to the promised land, they still want to maintain their religious identity. Now, of course, the 10 lost tribes failed to do that. They became lost in their idea of who they were. They lost their identity because they were not able to live within that foreign culture and maintain their identity, and they lost the knowledge of Jehovah as their God. And yet the two tribes of the country of Judah was able to maintain that cohesiveness despite all of the environment that they lived through and the dispersions and the return, etc. They maintained this cohesiveness that the other 10 tribes, of which probably most of us are part of, we lost it. We weren't able to maintain it. And so that's kind of an interesting conflict that you see throughout the entire book of Esther.
Never thought of it that way, but yeah, no, you're right. We can certainly apply that to our lives today. I mean, that's what,
Exactly.
yeah,
So the relevance for us today is that most members of the church live outside of an area where there's a majority of members of the church. There are only very few select places where we are a majority. So I remember growing up in Ontario years and years ago. Ooh, I can say decades ago, back in the 1900s, when I would have been the only member of the church in whatever group, whether it would be school, maybe at times it would be my brother or sister in school with me, but mostly I was on my own. I didn't have people in the groups that I traveled in most of the time. I wasn't part of the majority until Sunday when I went to church. When you're living in that kind of environment, you can have this appreciation for the story where she doesn't speak up because you tend to speak less openly about your religion when you're a very, very distinct minority and maybe even persecuted. And you pick your moments where you're going to make a declaration, very much like Esther did. She kept silent through all that time until the moment was right where she made her declaration, and then she was able to make this difference. Now, there's an interesting conflict here too, because Mordecai was this outwardly very Jewish person, and yet he tells her to hide her religion. And so you have to wonder about that just a little bit. So there are times when you want to be outwardly very religious, and there are times when it's not necessary to call attention to yourself. So the book of Esther feels very familiar to those who have spent most of our lives being outside of the majority, where we're a minority and or maybe we're even persecuted. This book is very relevant to us today. And you can look at it and you could spend time, especially in your own personal life, investigating the book and diving deeper to learn a little bit about not only how she operated, but how maybe we should operate sometimes in our own life. Do you see the hand of God in your life? Well, in anybody's life, I think we don't initially see the hand of God. There's no thus we sees on the wall that says, oh, pay attention here. And then there are a lot of coincidences or what looks like coincidences that happen, not only in her life, but in our own lives. For example, if the king had not had a sleepless night and hadn't had the books read to him and hadn't remembered about Mordecai, or if Mordecai hadn't been the type of person who adopted his cousin and brought her into his family and into his protection, or if Esther had not followed the advice of Mordecai, I think we talked about this a little bit earlier, these seem like a lot of coincidences, but you can see the hand of the Lord kind of working behind the scenes, even though it's not overtly done, especially not in the book of Esther. So often we don't really see the hand of God until we look back and we kind of reflect. I thought about that in my own life. And I thought about what's helped me to improve my ability to recognize the hand of the Lord. And so I propose that question to you. Are there ways to improve our ability to recognize his hand in our lives?
Just an interesting thought, though. When you look at the three examples that you have there, and actually a fourth one would be like what prompted Mordecai to report the assassination plot to the king, right?
Exactly.
But when you look at three of those examples, that was just good people doing good things. I mean, yeah, the king not having a sleepless night, who knows about that. But I mean, Mordecai, Esther, they were just being good people. And that is the hand of the Lord. I'm not saying it's not the hand of the Lord. But that's also a way that we can also help to recognize the hand of the Lord, is to recognize when good people do good things. Or when people do good things is a part of.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking in that vein, but that's very interesting. If we just make right choices, then we're kind of working into what the Lord wants us to do anyway.
It's too easy, at least in the world, to focus on what people make mistakes and do bad things, but we could focus a lot more and celebrate a lot more when people do good things.
Well, and when we ask for something specifically from the Lord, we need to be where our feet are. We need to be aware that we've asked, and we need to, look for the miracle or whatever we need to do. Because so many times we ask and then we forget.
I think another way that will help us remember is if we actually write these things down, if we record them, not only for ourselves to help us to look back and reflect on what's happened in our lives, but for our children or grandchildren, potentially even our great grandchildren, to read about our lives and say, hey, wow, that was amazing what happened to you guys. The hand of the Lord truly was there. And I think one of the reasons for our personal histories, our journals, is simply that, to recognize the hand of the Lord, to realize that he has a huge impact on our lives. And one of the ways of doing that is just simply writing it down and reflecting on it. And then when you have those moments of hardship, then you can go back and read some of the stuff that you yourself wrote.
And it's important to share it with our children and their children.
Exactly. Okay, I want to talk about the idea of Purim, this holiday. Purim means the lots, as in casting lots, and the I am makes it plural, just like Elohim is plural. And it comes from the whole idea that Haman, when he was trying to determine when the execution date should be for all the Jews, he cast lots in order to determine, I think it was the 13th day of the last month of the year. And through divine intervention, this whole scheme that he has is avoided. Well, actually reversed. Those who sought to destroy the Jews were themselves destroyed. And this is painted very aptly in Esther chapter 9. Mordecai writes these things and sends letters to all the provinces, and they establish among them that the 14th day of the last day of the month and the 15th day, it's kind of a 2-day celebration every year, as the days wherein the Jews rested from their enemies, in the month which was turned unto them from sorrow to joy, from mourning into a good day, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, and of sending portions to one another and gifts to the poor. It's kind of an unusual festival. There are parades, there's dressing up, there's gift giving. It's kind of like 4th of July, Halloween, and Christmas all kind of rolled into one. And they reenact the story of Esther. And one of the reasons that they reenact the story is so that when Haman comes on and speaks, they can all boo together. And it's this kind of riotous sort of play that they do. And it's a remembrance for them of another Exodus, another way in which they were saved by the Lord. And it's remembered every year, and it's part of their festival seasons. which is something that's very significant to the Jewish people. Now, if you look at this picture, you can see a lot of people are dressed up as princesses, princes, kings, queens, but then you get, like Mario's there on the second row, and then there's some creature there over beside one of the girls that I don't even know what that is. But so it's kind of morphed from the original, which was just the telling of the story, into this almost carnivalesque kind of atmosphere. And it's really quite interesting. So I just thought that that was a unique way to remind everybody in their culture, in their religion, of the goodness of God and how he saved them.
When do they celebrate this?
It's either in March or April, and it changes every year because their calendars, revolves. The whole idea of Esther, or at least what I learned as I was studying this week, is that the Lord keeps his promises to the covenant people. It started with Abraham, that through his line, all the world would be blessed. And the Lord couldn't just have all the covenant people be wiped out. And so he made it possible for a Jewish orphan to become the queen. And then this arrogant king has his heart softened. And then a wicked advisor is eliminated. And a righteous man now becomes the new advisor to the king. And although God is never really mentioned in this book that we're studying this week in Esther, he's there the entire time. He's throughout the whole thing. He's in the background, orchestrating, helping, making things work so that the covenant people are saved. I just have a testimony that the Lord keeps his promises, that he made a covenant to a man named Abraham millennia ago, and the covenant's still in place. And he wants us to partake of this covenant. It's still in place, it's still valid. He still looks after us, provided that we do our part. And so that's kind of what I learned this week.